What can be privately owned? Public and private goods. Superscript 23, which reads: Before reading the section, you may find it helpful to review the material on public goods in Chapter 2. In this section, we turn to another fundamental question of property law. Should property rights be privately or collectively held? First, we use the economic distinction between public and private goods developed in Chapter 2 to differentiate those resources that will be most efficiently used if privately owned from those that will be most efficiently used if publicly owned. Most examples of property that we have discussed thus far in this book are what economists call private goods that economists describe as purely private, have the characteristic that one person's use precludes another's. For example, when one person eats an apple, others cannot eat it. A pair of pants can be worn only by one person at a time. A car cannot go two different directions simultaneously, and so forth. Now, these facts are sometimes summarized by saying that there is rivalry in the consumption of private goods. The polar opposite is purely public good, for which there is no rivalry in consumption. A conventional example of a public good is military security in the nuclear age. Supplying one citizen with protection from nuclear attack doesn't diminish the amount of protection supplied to other citizens. There's also another attribute that distinguishes private goods from public goods. Once property rights are defined over private goods, they are relatively cheap to enforce. Specifically, the owner can exclude others from using them at low cost. For example, a farm can be fenced at relatively low cost to exclude trespassing cattle. With public goods, however, it is costly to exclude anyone from enjoying them. To illustrate, it is virtually impossible to supply different amounts of protection against nuclear attack to different citizens. Having explained the private-public distinction in economics and law, we can now relate them to each other. The relationship is very simple. Efficiency requires that private goods should be privately owned and that public goods should be publicly owned. In other words, efficiency requires that rivalrous and excludable goods should be controlled by individuals or small groups of people, whereas non-rivalrous and non-excludable goods should be controlled by a large group of people, such as the state. Thus, the distinction between private and public goods should guide the development of property rules to answer the question, what can be privately owned? We can explain the central idea, not the details, for this prescription. By rivalrous, private goods must be used and consumed by individuals, not enjoyed equally by everyone. Efficiency requires the use and consumption of each private good by the party who values it the most. In a free market, exchanges occur until each good is held by the party who values it the most. Thus, the law can achieve the efficient allocation of private goods by, for example, lowering bargaining costs, by assigning clear and simple ownership rights. Once the state recognizes private property rights, the owner of a private good can exclude others from using or consuming that right, except by the owner's consent. The owner's power to exclude channels or use the consumption of private goods into voluntary exchange, which fosters the efficient use of those goods. This is an example of lubricating bargaining. In contrast, the technical character of public goods obstructs the use of bargaining to achieve efficiency. To illustrate, suppose that a particular city block is plagued by crime and some residents propose hiring a private guard. Many residents will voluntarily contribute to the guard's salary, but suppose that some refuse. The paying resident may instruct the guard not to aid non-payers in the event of a mugging. Even so, the presence of the guard on the street will make it safer for everyone, because muggers are unlikely to know who has and who has not paid for the guard's services. Given these facts, there is not much that the payers can do to compel non-payers to contribute. Those people who do not pay for their consumption of the public good are called free riders. To appreciate this concept, imagine that a streetcar has an electric meter in it, and in order to make to the streetcar move, the riders must put money into the meter. The riders will not realize that anyone who pays provides a free ride for everyone else. Perhaps some riders will, nonetheless, put their full fare into the meter. Some will put some money in, but not their full fare, and some will not put anything in at all. Because of free riders, not enough money will be put in a meter, so the streetcar company will provide fewer streetcars than efficiency requires. In general, markets supply too little of a public good because the private supplier cannot exclude users of it who do not pay their share of the costs. We have explained that private goods which exhibit rivalry and exclusion ought to be privately owned, and that public goods which exhibit non-rivalrous and non-exclusion ought to be publicly owned. We illustrate this proposition as applied to land. Some efficient uses of land involve a small area and affect a small group of people, such as building a house or growing corn. Housing or corn are rivalrous goods with low exclusion costs, so markets easily form for housing or corn. Other efficient uses of land involve a large area and affect a large group of people. For example, the use of an uncongested airspace by airplanes, or the use of the high seas for shipping are non-rivalrous, and exclusion is costly. Thus, airspace and the high seas are public goods. As congestion increases from more planes and ships, governments impose rules on the use of the air and seas. These are examples in which private goods and privately owned are privately owned and public goods are publicly owned as required for efficiency. There are, however, many examples of private goods that are publicly owned. Public ownership of a private good typically results in its misallocation, by which we mean that it is used or consumed by someone other than the person who values it the most. For example, leases for grazing cattle on public lands may be granted to the friends of politicians. Similarly, the officials who administer the leases may not monitor compliance to prevent overgrazing, and the ranchers who overgraze the land and cause it to erode. Much of the impetus for deregulation, which was a worldwide movement in the 1990s, came from the realization that much government activity concerns private goods, where markets should be lubricated rather than government intruding directly in the process of allocation. For example, the realization that transportation by railroad, airplane, and barge are private services that should be supplied by free markets has led to the dismantling of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Civil Aeronautics Board, and other regulatory agencies in the United States. One way to contrast private and public ownership is in terms of transaction costs. Private ownership imposes various transaction costs of private enforcement and exchange. Public ownership imposes transaction costs in terms of public administration and collective decision making. To illustrate the difference, consider two possible ways to control air pollution from a factory. The private property approach is to grant each property owner the right to clean air, protected by the remedy of compensatory damages. This method will result in many landowners suing for damages or bargaining to settle out of court. Alternatively, the public property approach would declare that clean air is a public good and assign the task of air quality control to a government agency. This method will result in political bargaining and regulations. From this perspective, the choice between private and public ownership should depend on whether costs of private enforcement and exchange are more or less than the cost of public administration and political bargaining. In the next chapter, we will continue developing these ideas, these themes by discussing two important questions. For what specific resources is private ownership more efficient than public or commercial ownership, and vice versa? And under what circumstances public or circumstances should government be allowed to take private property from citizens? Superscript 24, which reads, we are not, of course, suggesting that the current division of responsibility between public and private providers of goods and services necessarily follows the rules that we have just set down. That is, there are current instances of the government provision or subsidization of private goods and of the private under provision of public goods. The extent to which these anomalies exist and why they persist are two of the central concerns of the branch of microeconomic theory called public choice theory. Question 4.15. For everyone has free access to a public beach, who, if anyone, has the power to control the use of the resources? Question 4.16. Discuss how to adjust private and public property rights to promote ecotourism in Africa.